Hello and welcome to the second review of Request Month 2023. This is Black for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PlayStation 2 version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Criterion Games and published by Electronic Arts in 2006 for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. At the time, it was pretty well received both critically and by players themselves, with particular praise being leveled at the game's technical aspects, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Despite seemingly being a fairly successful game as far as sales go and the positive critical reception, it never got a sequel. There were plans for one, but they eventually got scuttled due to differences between Criterion Games and EA, and we did eventually get the spiritual successor in the form of a game called Body Count, which released on the PS3 and Xbox 360, but that's a subject for a different video entirely. Now, this video is concerned with the game that never made it off of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, and is frequently cited as one of the defining games for the PS2 in particular. But before I start delving into the game properly and examining how it is as a first-person shooter and how it holds up all these years later, I do have to mention a few things. First, there is a reason I don't often cover first and third-person shooters that are console exclusive. I absolutely despise playing them on a gamepad. They are just too sluggish and imprecise for the style of gameplay that first-person and third-person shooters are going for. And this is regardless of which gamepad I'm using or which system I'm playing it on. I mean, hell, I even find it frustrating trying to play first and third-person shooters on the Steam Deck with the haptic pads, and those are faster and more precise than analog sticks. This, of course, means that I have an inherent bias against console first and third-person shooters. However, since it's a bias specifically against the control method, regardless of which platform it's on, regardless of which gamepad it's on, for the purposes of reviewing, it doesn't factor into the review unless there is something specifically wrong with the controls in the game itself. For example, the controls simply not functioning correctly, or having really weird layouts that make it unintuitive to play, or something like that. The second thing to mention is that I have absolutely no nostalgia for this game whatsoever. I didn't have a PlayStation 2 or an Xbox at the time it came out, and I didn't get a copy of it until many, many years later, well into the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One generation. So since I have absolutely no nostalgia for the game whatsoever, I am really only concerned with how it is as a first-person shooter and how it holds up all these years later. So, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which immediately commits an unforgivable sin. The cutscenes are unskippable. Every single one of them, including the roughly 2-minute and 45-ish second opening cutscene that happens before you get to the main menu. You may be wondering why that's a problem. Well, I first started messing around with this game on the Xbox version, and thus I had to sit through that cutscene. Then I ended up in a situation where I couldn't have my Xbox set up for a while, and so I ended up going to the PlayStation 2 version, which I got a copy of for really cheap, and I started messing around with it on PlayStation. And thus I had to sit through the cutscene again. And then I decided to try to make my life a bit easier when it comes to recording gameplay footage, because trying to set up all of the cables and such to record from my PlayStation 2 was a pain in the ass, so I decided to play my copy of the game on an emulator, and thus I had to sit through the cutscene again. And again. And again, and again, and again, until eventually I had to sit through that cutscene about a dozen times. Now, I understand that my situation there is definitely an outlier, but it's still incredibly annoying, and it highlights the problem with regards to unskippable cutscenes, particularly one before the main menu that is nothing more than a credits sequence. It adds absolutely nothing to the game other than some tedious downtime before you get to the main menu so you can actually play the damn game in the first place. But then you start the game up properly, and you start trying to actually experience the gameplay and the storyline, and you find that all of the cutscenes throughout the entire campaign are unskippable as well, and nearly all of those are a live-action interrogation sequence that is just cut up between the missions. And hopefully you're not deaf or hard of hearing, because there are absolutely no subtitles in this game at all. As for the cutscenes themselves, the developers clearly thought they were some sort of tense and exciting thing, when in reality they're extremely uninteresting. I'll talk about that more when I talk about the storyline, but suffice to say the cutscenes really don't inspire any confidence in this thing. Certainly not the intro cutscene, and definitely not the cutscenes in between missions. But what about the actual in-engine visuals, not simply the live-action cutscenes? Well, while I'm on the subject of cutscenes, there is exactly one cutscene in the entire game that is rendered in-engine. And because all of the other cutscenes in the game are live action, it feels completely out of place. Not to mention, it's just a really boring and kind of pointless cutscene. But you're probably tired of hearing me ramble about cutscenes now, so let's talk about the actual game as you're playing it. Now, as you might expect from a PlayStation 2 and original Xbox game, this looks very dated by modern standards. That said, for a PlayStation 2 game, it was actually quite visually impressive, particularly the amount of particle effects and the amount of destructibility in the environments, especially considering that the game was not only playable, but it actually runs relatively decently for the hardware that it was on. I mean, it's targeting 30 frames per second, and it mostly manages to stay at that, so while 30 FPS is certainly not ideal, definitely not for a first-person shooter, it being able to stay at a mostly consistent 30 frames per second is actually fairly impressive. It does have some frame rate drops here and there, of course, but it's certainly not enough to tank the entire experience. Then, of course, there's the actual visual quality itself, which is, well, let's face it, this is a PlayStation 2 game. It didn't really look all that good when it came out in 2006, and between the merely serviceable modeling for the time and the rather low texture quality, and more importantly, the very muted color scheme that is dangerously close to triggering the channel's meme about that, Black is a game whose visuals have really not aged gracefully. That is, of course, assuming that you can actually see what's going on, because this game has a nasty habit of completely obscuring the screen at nearly all times. They clearly took some design cues from Fear, which came out the previous year, and which featured incredibly impressive particle effects for the time, as well as impressive amounts of environmental damage, meaning that whenever you got into a firefight in Fear, the area would erupt into glorious chaos as you were blasting chunks out of walls and kicking up dust, blasting all manner of office supplies off of desks and things like that, all the while eviscerating your foes, blasting them into meaty chunks and things like that. It was all absolutely glorious, and Criterion clearly thought they could do that with a PlayStation 2 and Xbox, and to some degree they succeeded. When you get into firefights in Black, the amount of particle effects and smoke that's being kicked up is absolutely insane. In fact, it's so insane that it completely obscures the screen and makes it damn near impossible to tell what's going on at any given point. As if that weren't enough, they threw in a ridiculous amount of blurring effects to make it even more difficult to tell what's going on. One of the most annoying is the reload effect. Whenever you go to reload your gun, everything behind your gun gets blurred out to a ridiculous degree, meaning that you can't tell what's going on. And it's all in service of animations that make anybody who's even remotely familiar with how firearms work cringe. I don't know whether they just thought they were being cool or they just really wanted to show off their honestly not very good reload animations, but it's incredibly annoying, and it gets more annoying the further you get into the game when you start running into more and more enemies that can do a lot of damage to you very quickly. It's like they forgot basic principles of action game design, not even first-person shooter design specifically, because this was apparently their first first-person shooter, but no, just action game principles in general. Situational awareness is extremely important, and Criterion basically extended their middle finger to that idea entirely in favor of ridiculous amounts of visual noise to the point where it's completely disorientating and actually quite irritating. So all those fancy particle effects and that environmental destruction that got so praised by so many people is really a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's technically impressive for a PS2 game, and in theory, it makes the game more exciting. The problem is they went overboard with it to the point where it actively interferes with your ability to play the game. And what's even funnier about all of this is that all of the carnage you see on screen from all the random things exploding and all the particle effects being kicked up and such, in the midst of all that, there is not a single drop of blood. This is an M-rated game. That is the second highest rating that the ESRB offers. It is roughly equivalent to PEGI 18. And yet it doesn't have a single drop of blood in the entire thing. No blood puffs, no blood pools on the ground or walls or anything like that. Nothing. Just puffs of smoke whenever you shoot at enemies. Frankly, it actually makes the game look pretty ridiculous. I mean, that's the kind of thing you would have expected from censored German releases at the time, but that's just how this game is across all regions. They just didn't put any blood in it for some reason. And that may make you wonder why the hell this got the M rating in North America. Well, it's because they just arbitrarily decide several missions into the game to start dropping the word fuck. It's like they just suddenly remembered that they had a more mature rating, so they just arbitrarily decided to start dropping the word fuck into every other sentence, and it's actually kind of hilarious. This, of course, brings me to the audio, more specifically the voice acting, which is, well, it's decent, actually. It's nothing impressive, but they do a decent enough job with what they're given. The problem is that I'm not entirely sure what tone this game is actually going for, because the actual gameplay is completely over the top and ridiculous, while the voice acting makes it seem like they're actually taking their storyline very seriously. Not that that really matters all that much for reasons I'll explain when I get to the story, but it is something worth mentioning. Then you move over into other aspects of the sound, and I'll be fair here, for a PlayStation 2 game they actually did quite a good job with most of it. Most of the issues you're going to run into with the sound are really just more limitations of the platform that it's on more than anything else. The audio quality gets in the way of what would otherwise be some pretty decently punchy weapon and explosion sounds that certainly don't rock you around quite as much as I'd really like, but they definitely get the job done pretty well. Then there's the soundtrack, which most people seem to attribute to Michael Giacchino, except that he only worked on the main theme of the game. And he did that in cooperation with the guy who actually did the soundtrack for the game, which is Chris Tilton. The thing is, most of the game is actually not accompanied by music. When the music does kick in, you find that it's orchestral stuff that's decent enough, but unfortunately is fairly generic action movie soundtrack material. The kind of thing that sounds like it's trying to be a cross between a generic World War II movie and is also trying to rip off the movie The Rock at the same time. Again, it's decent music in and of itself, it's just that it's really not all that memorable in the long run. And more importantly, most of the time the action is so heavy that the sound effects tend to drown out the soundtrack and you end up not really noticing it. Despite this, when you look at the presentation as a whole, it does end up being fairly impressive for a PlayStation 2 game. The problem is they achieved that by sacrificing playability. And that means that the two components of the game that really matter, the story and the gameplay, have a lot more heavy lifting to do. So how are the story and the gameplay? Well, let's go ahead and start by talking about the story. The game is set up as something of a frame story in the sense that the opening cutscene shows the main protagonist, Keller, being brought into an interrogation room and thus being interrogated over the events of the past several days. The idea is that you're playing through what he's telling the interrogator, except that the actual story is completely detached from what you're actually doing in the game. You get these live-action cutscenes in between missions where Keller and the interrogator are doing their thing, and then when you actually get into the mission itself, it's just a video game level. It doesn't actually progress the plot in any meaningful way. Hell, most of the time the objectives you're going through don't have anything to do with the plot either. They're just random military shooter objectives that you have to accomplish. So you end up with this weird situation where the story is not interwoven into the gameplay really at all. There's only some token references here and there as you're progressing the levels, so you're just not really gonna care what's going on in the cutscenes. And even if you were to pay attention to the cutscenes, you find out almost immediately that the game doesn't actually have much of a story. I mean, Keller is a Black Ops agent who's a bit of a loose cannon, who kinda plays by his own rules and doesn't really care what his orders are, and he just runs in and lays waste to anything that gets in his way between him and the objective. What is the objective? Well, he's going up against a group of bad guys called Seventh Wave who are involved in all manner of nefarious plots, and more specifically is going after one particular bad guy who was previously a fellow Black Ops agent, meaning that we have drama because he's going after a traitor. Except that we never actually see this guy outside of a single photograph in one of the cutscenes. None of the characters involved in this story are even the slightest bit interesting. At absolute best, they're really not much more than archetype characters, and even then, they're barely even present. Even the main protagonist only talks about what he's doing objective-wise throughout the entire game. He doesn't have any actual personality or anything to make him interesting. The end result of all this is a story so subatomically thin, it frankly shouldn't even be in the game at all. It's basically deadweight. It is actively holding the game back by having you sit through these unskippable cutscenes between missions. And even with those unskippable cutscenes, the entire campaign is barely 3.5 hours long. This was one of the chief complaints about the game from when it originally released, by the way, and for very good reason. Black is a single-player only game. It has no multiplayer of any kind, and it doesn't have anything to it other than the campaign. No alternate modes, no extra missions that you unlock after beating the campaign, just the campaign by itself. It does have an unlock system, but there are only 3 things that you can unlock. The first of them is silver weapons, which have infinite ammunition. The second of them is a special weapon that gives you an underslung grenade launcher. And the third thing is higher difficulty settings. That's all you get. You get the 3.5 hour single player campaign, and you can unlock a few things for replaying said single-player campaign if you feel like it. So it better be one hell of a first-person shooter if it's going to justify its $40 to $50 asking price on launch. So what is the gameplay like? Well, it's a military-themed first-person shooter. You run around and you blast enemies. You have a 2-weapon limit. You can pick up weapons off of fallen enemies, or sometimes you can find them scattered around the levels. The actual weapon variety is pretty limited. You have access to only a few weapon types, and most of them behave very similarly to one another. Submachine guns, assault rifles, and the M249, which is a light machine gun, all behave almost exactly the same, just with different ammunition capacities based on which weapon you're using, and submachine guns and assault rifles sometimes have the capability of attaching a suppressor, but if you want to use that, you have to find one somewhere in the level, and frankly, the suppressor doesn't really matter. It changes the firing sound and theoretically makes you stealthier, except I found that enemies would notice me no matter what, and there really weren't any penalties for not being stealthy, so you might as well just go in guns blazing all the time. Aside from the guns, you can do melee bashing attacks, and you can also throw grenades at enemies, and unlike a lot of military shooters that you see around this time, you don't get aiming down the sights. If you press the aim button, it just zooms in, unless you're using the sniper rifle, in which case it does aim down the scope. This was a bit before regenerating health became the norm, so it still uses a finite health system. You have a health bar up in the top left of the screen, and after you've taken damage, you can replenish your health by picking up first aid kits from fallen enemies, or by finding various health packs scattered around the levels that you can carry around with you, up to 3 at any given time, and you can use those to replenish a much larger portion of your health. As you wander around the levels, you will need to be fighting enemies and completing objectives in order to progress. There are 2 different types of objectives. There are the main objectives, which will actually progress the level, but most missions will also require you to complete a certain number of side objectives, of which each level has quite a lot of, so you only need to complete a few of them in order to progress, but if you complete all of the side objectives, most of which is just finding collectibles or shooting something, then you might unlock the harder difficulty settings, or the underslung grenade launcher, or the silver weapons. But those will only be accessible after you try to play the mission again after completing it. Now you may be thinking to yourself, if you're familiar with first-person shooters of the era, that all sounds fairly standard. And it is, because this is just a very standard first-person shooter for its era. You're not even fighting all that many different enemy types. You got your basic grunts with assault rifles or SMGs. You've got a more armored opponent that has a shotgun. You have a heavily armored opponent with a shield that you either need to throw grenades at or just get around their shield in order to take down. And then you have guys with machine guns and snipers. And that's all you're going to be fighting throughout the entire game. They are all very bland enemy types, and they're also extremely stupid. The AI in this game is ridiculously dumb. They basically just let themselves be annihilated with extreme ease. And the only 2 things that render them even the slightest bit of a challenge toward the player are that they are absolute bullet sponges and they can do quite a lot of damage to you. And by ridiculously bullet spongy, I mean that unless you're dealing with the most basic of grunt type enemies, you're going to be spending often half a magazine or more of ammunition, sometimes even multiple magazines worth of ammunition to take down a single enemy, unless you're getting headshots. And even then, it frequently takes a lot of headshots to bring an enemy down. I mean, even the basic shotgunner type enemies take usually 3 or 4 headshots to bring down. And when you start encountering the heavily armored shield wielding enemies, well, you could basically shove your gun down those enemies' throats and get nothing but headshots, and even then you still might be using about half a magazine to bring a single one of them down. And that probably sounds pretty excessive already, but it gets even more insane when you realize that they have dramatically increased the magazine size on most of the weapons. I mean, to give you a prime example, at the very beginning of the game you get access to the AK-47, which you find out doesn't actually have 30 round magazines like it would in real life. It has 60 round magazines. The G36 has 70 round magazines. The M4 has 90 round. That's 90 round magazines. And yet for some utterly baffling reason, the magazine model they use for the M4 is the classic Vietnam era 20 round magazine. It's the kind of thing that is so stupid and ridiculous it actually makes your brain hurt. I mean, don't get me wrong, I get that it's based on action movies, and heroes basically never reload in action movies, but when you're trying to compensate for bullet sponge enemies by having ridiculously huge magazine sizes, and it still takes a ridiculous amount of rounds to bring enemies down, you have fundamentally failed at making your weapons actually feel good to use, which is ironic because they were trying to avoid that. They were trying to make a game where every single weapon would be useful throughout the entire thing, and they ended up making a game where basically none of the weapons, except for the Magnum and the launchers, are actually all that useful. And as you might expect, ammunition for those is very limited. But even beyond the absurd bullet sponginess of enemies and the weird magazine sizes and the weapons all basically feeling the same regardless of what they are as long as they're in similar categories. I mean, all the submachine guns, all the assault rifles, and the light machine gun, the M249, all feel basically the same. They just have different magazine sizes, and some of them have particularly long reload animations compared to others. That's about it, really. And since the enemies are so bullet spongy, you're basically incentivized to use the fully automatic weapons the entire game and never take them off of fully automatic mode. Just spray bullets in the general direction of enemies until eventually they fall over. You may be asking, but DW, you mentioned headshots do extra damage, so why wouldn't you go for headshots? Well, that's just it. You probably are going to try to go for headshots, and that's where you start running into the real problem of the shooting mechanics, more so than anything I've said up to this point, which is the controls. And this goes beyond my simple dislike of playing first and third person shooters on gamepads. This game has absolutely no options whatsoever for adjusting your look or aiming sensitivity. You know, a basic feature of first-person shooters that's been in the genre since the 90s and a commonplace thing in console first-person shooters since the late 90s. And this game came out in 2006. And not only do you have to deal with the game's default sensitivity, which is quite slow, I might add, but they also put aim acceleration in there, so whenever you're trying to aim at something, you're going to end up with variable speed on that. It never gets very fast, but it goes from sluggish to slightly faster at a bit of a drop of a hat, and it ends up messing up your aim more often than not. And despite the game having aim assist, where if you get close enough to an enemy it will track them just a bit, that barely helps, especially when there are multiple targets in a relatively close area and it starts tracking the wrong one, the one that you're not actually trying to aim at. And all of that brought together makes the basic shooting mechanics in this first-person shooter where almost the entirety of what you're doing is running around and shooting enemies a surprisingly frustrating experience. And the especially baffling part of this is that even though it doesn't give you any options for aim sensitivity or acceleration or anything like that, you have fully customizable button binds. You can go into the options and set any of the buttons on the controller to whatever you want them to be. I have absolutely no idea why they set it up this way. It makes no sense to give you full customization of your button bindings while also not giving you any options for aim acceleration or aim sensitivity. But funnily enough, it's a good thing that the controls are customizable because the default control schemes have R1 being the fire button and L1 being the aim button. Because clearly playing a first-person shooter where the shoulder buttons are your aim and shoot controls as opposed to, I don't know, the trigger buttons makes so much sense. But you know what? At least they give you the ability to fix that. Unlike all of the other issues the game has that ultimately drag it down to the depths. If it did not suffer from the control problems, if it didn't completely obscure what you were doing with the ridiculous amount of particle effects and smoke on screen, making it damn near impossible to tell what's actually happening during firefights, then Black would be a fairly mid first-person shooter for its era. Instead, they went all in on style over substance, sacrificing even basic playability for the sake of having really impressive smoke and particle effects. Well, congratulations, you've succeeded on having really impressive smoke and particle effects for a PlayStation 2 game. But in doing so, Criterion took what would otherwise be a fairly average at best first-person shooter for consoles of the time, and turned it into something that was mechanically subpar for the era, and while it was certainly impressive for a PlayStation 2 and to some degree an original Xbox game, remember that this came out the same year that the PlayStation 3 launched. It came out a year after the Xbox 360 launched, and it came out a year before Crysis released on PC. As impressive as this looked for a PlayStation 2 game of the era, it was still a PlayStation 2 game, and PlayStation 2 had been dramatically outclassed. And while the Xbox version certainly looked better, it was still an original Xbox game at a time when those had also been outclassed. So you end up with a game that has a lot of the woes that you see with a lot of tech demo type games where they have really impressive technical aspects, but then the actual substance of the game, the gameplay, the story, stuff like that, is either average at best or is downright mediocre or worse. But it was also at the tail end of its console generation after much better, more impressive hardware had come out and was capable of far more impressive things. This puts Black into a really weird position. Like I said, if you completely take out the elements that drag the game down, it would have been maybe an average at best first-person shooter. Certainly not worth the full $40 to $50 asking price, but not necessarily a bad game. Maybe something you would pick up if it was on sale. With the problems, however, it was a subpar game at absolute best for its time, and really it hasn't aged all that well either. It's certainly not awful, but it's also something that I find basically impossible to recommend as anything other than a historical curiosity. Because once you get past all the visual noise, you realize that that was just a distraction for what is otherwise a very weak first-person shooter. One that unfortunately doesn't manage to go any higher on my scale than a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.